Picture a cold morning inside the Tower of London, the year 1541. An elderly woman, her hair streaked with silver beneath a worn veil, is led out into the courtyard. She is not a common criminal, nor a rebel caught in battle. She is Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, one of the last living heirs of the Plantagenet dynasty, a bloodline once crowned, now condemned. And for that blood alone, she is about to die. There is no trial. No sentence read aloud. Only a sudden order from King Henry VIII. Within the hour, Margaret's fate is sealed. But her execution will not be swift, nor merciful. The chief executioner is away, and in his place stands a trembling boy with an axe too heavy for his hands. His first strike misses her neck entirely, slicing into her shoulder. The second crashes into the base of her skull. Blow after blow rains down, clumsy and brutal, until at last her head is severed. Margaret Pole, 67 years old, dies in agony, her noble body mutilated in front of a horrified crowd. Yet this gruesome end was only the final chapter of a life scarred by tragedy. Born into privilege, she lost her mother as a child and watched her father executed for treason. Her only brother was locked in the Tower and eventually killed. Through it all, Margaret sought no throne, no crown. She lived with loyalty, dignity, and faith. But in Henry VIII's England, her lineage itself was a crime. This is the story of Margaret Pole, the woman who never wanted power, yet paid the ultimate price for it. Margaret Pole entered the world on August 14, 1473, at Farleigh Castle near Bath, in the heart of England's turbulent 15th century. To the outside world, her birth was a blessing. She was the daughter of George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, and Isabel Neville, whose father Richard Neville, better known as Warwick, the Kingmaker, was one of the most powerful figures in the entire realm. With such blood coursing through her veins, Margaret seemed destined for a life of privilege, power, and security. But in England at the time, noble blood was as much a curse as it was a gift. Margaret was born into a family that stood at the crossroads of dynasties, where loyalty shifted with the wind and survival depended less on love and more on political calculation. Her childhood would quickly prove that in the royal Game of Thrones, no child, no matter how innocent, was safe. From the very beginning, the shadow of violence loomed over her life. Just 2 years before her birth, her grandfather Warwick had fallen at the Battle of Barnet, cut down while fighting against the very king he once helped place on the throne, Edward IV, Margaret's uncle. That loss was more than personal tragedy, it set the stage for chaos that would ripple through the lives of George, Isabel, and ultimately their children. By the time Margaret turned 3, tragedy had already struck again. Her mother Isabel died in December 1476, at only 25 years old. Modern historians believe the cause was either consumption or complications following childbirth. But her father, George, refused to accept such explanations. Grief twisted into paranoia, and paranoia into violence. George became convinced that his young wife had been poisoned, and he fixed his rage upon one of Isabel's attendants, a woman named Margaret Pole. In a fit of fury, he stormed into her home, dragged her away, and staged what could only be called a sham trial at Warwick Castle. Margaret was stripped of her jewelry, accused of slipping poison into Isabel's drink, and declared guilty by a jury that trembled under George's threats. Within hours, she was executed. No evidence, no fairness, just the raw power of a duke blinded by grief. For little Margaret, the horror of her mother's death was followed by the spectacle of injustice, a reminder that the walls of a castle offered no true protection. Years later, King Edward IV would issue a posthumous pardon for Margaret, but that meant nothing to a child who had already lost her mother and witnessed her father's cruelty. Life in her father's household after Isabel's death was lonely and unstable. George was rarely present, spending his days at court or abroad, consumed by his own ambitions and insecurities. When he was home, his temper and reckless decisions cast a long shadow. Margaret was surrounded by nursemaids and attendants, but she lacked the warmth of a stable family. George's ambitions soon drew him toward an even riskier path. He schemed to marry Mary of Burgundy, one of the wealthiest heiresses in Europe, whose inheritance could have made him a king in all but name. His brother Edward IV, wary of George's rebellious streak, blocked the match. Instead of accepting the decision, George sulked and grew resentful. The resentment festered until it led him into fatal territory. In 1477, one of George's astrologers confessed under torture to predicting Edward IV's death. The astrologer named associates, some of whom were executed. George wasn't directly implicated, but he made a grave mistake. He arranged for one of the condemned men's pleas of innocence to be read aloud before the royal council. To Edward IV, this was the final betrayal. George was arrested, charged with treason, and locked in the Tower of London. A bill of attainder stripped him of his titles and condemned him to death. On February 18, 1478, when Margaret was only 4 years old, her father was executed in private within the tower. Rumors circulated for centuries that he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, his favorite drink, though whether that story is true hardly matters. For Margaret, the reality was that her father was gone, disgraced, and with him went every title and estate that had defined her family's prestige. In just a few short years, Margaret Pole had lost both parents. Her mother to illness, her father to treason. Her family's fortunes crumbled overnight. Lands and honors that should have been her inheritance were seized by the crown. She and her brother Edward, barely old enough to understand the shifting tides of power, were left vulnerable. Instead of being raised as the wealthy heirs of the Duke of Clarence, they became royal wards, children of noble blood but stripped of security. Their new lives placed them in the care of their royal cousins, an arrangement that underscored both their value and their danger. Margaret and Edward were Plantagenets, niece and nephew to a king, cousins to princes, but they were also reminders of the fragility of the Yorkist dynasty. Their very existence meant that one day, if fortune shifted again, someone might rally to their claim. For Margaret, childhood was not about play or freedom. It was about survival. Every lesson she learned, every face she saw at court, every whisper in the corridors carried a weight of suspicion. Children of noble houses were rarely just children, they were symbols, pawns, or threats. Margaret's lineage meant she could never simply fade into the background. By 1483, when she was just 10 years old, another storm struck. Her uncle Edward IV died suddenly, leaving his young son Edward V as king. Margaret must have watched anxiously as her 12-year-old cousin took the throne, only to be placed in the Tower of London alongside his younger brother Richard. Their uncle, Richard of Gloucester, seized power for himself, declaring the boys illegitimate and crowning himself Richard III. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower remains one of England's greatest mysteries. Whether they were murdered or hidden, the result was the same: the throne passed to Richard, and once again, the Plantagenet line splintered under suspicion and bloodshed. For Margaret and her brother Edward, their position grew even more precarious. They were moved to Sheriff Hutton Castle in Yorkshire. While treated with a degree of respect, their confinement was a reminder that royal blood was both a privilege and a prison. Here, Margaret's childhood ended in earnest. She was not yet a teenager, yet she had already lived through her mother's death, her father's execution, the destruction of her inheritance, and the disappearance of her cousins. Each tragedy etched a lesson onto her soul: trust no fortune, believe in no permanence, and remember that royal favor could turn to royal wrath overnight. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury-to-be, had been born into one of the most prestigious families in England. But by the end of her first decade, she was already walking the knife's edge between privilege and peril, a path that would shape every moment of the long and tragic life still ahead of her. By the spring of 1483, Margaret Pole was just 10 years old, still more child than woman. Yet once again, the world around her shifted in violent and irreversible ways. On April 9 of that year, her uncle King Edward IV died suddenly, leaving the throne to his 12-year-old son, Edward V. For Margaret, this moment was another reminder that her family's fortunes were tied to the crown in ways that could bring either salvation or ruin. At first, the kingdom seemed prepared for the young Edward's coronation. The boy king and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, were escorted toward London, where they were to await the ceremony. But in May, their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, intervened. Under the guise of protecting his nephews, Richard placed both boys in the Tower of London. Officially, it was said to be for their safety until the coronation. But whispers at court told a different story. Only weeks later, Richard declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been illegitimate. If true, then the two princes were bastards, unfit to rule. Conveniently, that left Richard himself as the rightful heir. By summer's end, Richard had seized the throne, crowning himself Richard III. The fate of young Edward V and his brother remains one of history's most enduring mysteries. The princes in the Tower, as they came to be known, vanished without a trace. Some believed they had been murdered on Richard's orders. Others thought they were hidden away by loyalists. Centuries later, the truth is still uncertain. But for Margaret, the outcome was clear: the Plantagenet bloodline, once spread across England's royal houses, was being consumed from within. With Edward IV's sons gone, the line of succession shifted dangerously close to Margaret and her brother Edward. They were still children, but they carried names and heritage that could one day rally supporters. Richard III could not ignore them. The siblings were moved to Sheriff Hutton Castle in Yorkshire, a place of confinement disguised as custody. There, under careful watch, they lived with both privilege and imprisonment. Despite the walls that contained them, they were treated with a measure of respect. Tutors ensured their education, and attendants met their needs. Some even whispered that if Richard and his wife, and Neville, failed to produce an heir, Edward Plantagenet, Margaret's younger brother, might be considered as successor. Such speculation was dangerous. To a king paranoid about legitimacy, every rumor was a threat. For Margaret, Sheriff Hutton was a gilded cage. She could study, pray, and grow under supervision, but she could not escape the reality that her family's name was both her greatest strength and her greatest danger. Every meal she ate, every letter she received, every word spoken in her presence carried the weight of politics. Then, in 1485, the storm finally broke. Richard III faced rebellion from Henry Tudor, a claimant whose lineage to the crown was tenuous at best. Henry's mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, had ties to the royal family through an illegitimate branch. Alone, his claim would have been weak. But rebellion was not always about bloodlines, it was about opportunity. And the kingdom, weary of civil strife, saw in Henry a chance for change. The decisive battle came at Bosworth Field in August 1485. Richard III, armored in his royal crown, led his troops into the fray. In a display of personal courage, he fought until the very end. But courage was not enough. Betrayed by allies and overwhelmed by Henry's forces, Richard was cut down on the battlefield, the last English king to die in combat. His crown was famously retrieved from a thorn bush and placed on Henry Tudor's head, signaling the birth of a new dynasty, the Tudors. For Margaret, this moment was bittersweet. On one hand, Richard III, the uncle who had confined her and her brother, was gone. On the other, Henry VII's claim to the throne was shaky, and that made the surviving Plantagenets a danger to his reign. And Margaret's brother Edward, the young Earl of Warwick, was the most dangerous of all. Edward's claim to the throne was stronger than Henry's. He was the son of George Plantagenet and Isabel Neville, nephew to two kings, and cousin to the vanished princes. For Henry, Edward represented a living banner around which discontented nobles could rally. So, in a decision that mirrored Richard III's treatment of the boys in the Tower, Henry had Edward imprisoned there in 1485. The boy was only 10 years old. For Margaret, watching her younger brother disappear behind the Tower's stone walls was another cruel twist of fate. He had already lost both parents, now he was condemned to a life of confinement. His very existence made him dangerous. His very blood was his curse. The Tower of London had already swallowed the princes. Now it consumed Edward as well. But rumors do not stay buried. In 1487, a rebellion erupted led by a boy named Lambert Simnel, who claimed to be Edward Plantagenet himself. Across Europe, noblemen and foreign rulers lent their support. The rebellion was serious enough that Henry was forced to parade the Real Edward through the streets of London to prove he still lived. It was a spectacle designed to quell dissent. But instead of ending the rumors, it only kept the Plantagenet claim alive. Henry VII, ever cautious, sent Edward back to the Tower. He would never emerge again as a free man. Meanwhile, Margaret's own life was being carefully managed. She was approaching marriageable age, and in an England where dynastic threats lurked in every corner, her hand in marriage was a political tool. To neutralize her claim, Henry arranged her betrothal to his cousin, Sir Richard Pole, a man of loyalty but lesser status. In 1487, at the age of 14, Margaret married Richard. It was not a match of passion or choice. It was a strategy. For Margaret, the marriage offered stability but at the cost of her dynastic value. She had been born the daughter of a duke and niece to kings. Now, she was married into a family of loyal servants, a deliberate step down from the heights of her birth. It was Henry VII's way of ensuring she would never become the center of rebellion. Yet even in this compromise, Margaret found a kind of peace. Richard Pole was a steady and dutiful husband, rising through the ranks in service to the king. Margaret, after years of loss and instability, finally had a household of her own, and in time, children to carry forward her name. But even as she settled into domestic life, the fate of her brother Edward continued to haunt her. By 1499, Edward's long imprisonment took a tragic turn. He befriended another prisoner, Perkin Warbeck, a pretender claiming to be one of the lost princes in the Tower. Together, they plotted escape. Henry VII seized upon this as treason. Edward, now 24, was brought to trial. The verdict was predetermined. On November 28, 1499, he was executed. For Margaret, the blow was crushing. Her brother, the last male Plantagenet of their line, was gone. She was now alone, the final direct descendant of the house that once ruled England. And though she still had her marriage, her children, and her estates, Margaret could not escape the reality that her bloodline had become both her legacy and her doom. By the late 1480s, Margaret Plantagenet's life had been defined by loss. She had seen her parents torn away, her inheritance stripped, and her brother imprisoned in the Tower. When Edward's execution in 1499 closed the chapter on the last male Plantagenet of her direct line, Margaret's blood became both a legacy and a liability. She had no throne to claim, no armies to command. Yet to Henry VII, the first Tudor king, her very existence was dangerous. And the surest way to control danger was through marriage. Margaret was still only a teenager when the king chose her husband. He did not pick a powerful duke or foreign prince. Instead, he chose Sir Richard Pole, his own cousin on his mother's side. Richard was loyal, capable, and safe. By binding Margaret to him, Henry ensured that her dynastic claim would be folded into the Tudor sphere, diluted by loyalty rather than sharpened into rivalry. The match, arranged in 1487, was not one of passion. Margaret was about 14 years old, Richard perhaps 15 years older. Yet the marriage was practical, and for Margaret, practicality was a form of salvation. She could not afford to dream of love, she needed stability. After years of shifting guardianship and uncertainty, Richard Pole offered her a household of her own, a chance to step out of the shadow of the Tower. The two were wed in November of that year. Though historians debate whether Margaret ever truly felt affection for Richard, the marriage appears to have been steady and respectful. Richard rose in royal service, gaining positions of trust under Henry VII. He became constable of key castles, sheriff of important shires, and eventually chamberlain to Prince Arthur, the king's heir. For Margaret, each promotion meant greater security. She was no longer merely a potential claimant, she was the wife of a Tudor loyalist. In 1492, Margaret gave birth to her first son. Appropriately, he was named Henry, after the king himself. The name was not simply a gesture of loyalty, it was a shield. By naming her son after the monarch, Margaret signaled her acceptance of the Tudor order. She was not plotting rebellion. She was building a family that would live and serve under the crown. The years that followed brought both joy and sorrow. Childbirth in the late 15th century was perilous, and many pregnancies ended in silence. After Henry, Margaret endured several years without recorded births. Whether these were miscarriages, stillbirths, or simply gaps in the historical record, the effect was the same: uncertainty. For a noble woman, producing heirs was both duty and protection. Each child was another thread binding her to the present instead of the dangerous claims of the past. In 1499, Margaret bore another son, Arthur, likely named in honor of Prince Arthur, the Tudor heir whom her husband served. That same year, Richard Pole's star rose higher. He oversaw the proxy marriage between Prince Arthur and Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess whose union would strengthen England's ties to Europe. Richard was knighted into the prestigious Order of the Garter, a mark of distinction that elevated the Pole family within Tudor society. For Margaret, this was a moment of fragile triumph. After years of fear, she now stood at the heart of royal affairs. Her husband's duties often took him to Wales, but she maintained their households, balancing life between estates in Buckinghamshire and Staffordshire. Their marriage, though born of strategy, had settled into a rhythm of loyalty and mutual respect. By 1500, Margaret gave birth to her third son, Reginald. Unlike his brothers, Reginald's path would diverge from courtly service. When Richard Pole died unexpectedly in 1504, leaving Margaret widowed at just 31, Reginald was sent into the church. For Margaret, the decision was agonizing but necessary. As a widow with limited income and 5 children, she could not support them all. By dedicating Reginald to a religious life, she reduced her burden while ensuring him a form of security. The boy, however, never forgave her. Years later, he would accuse his mother of abandoning him while favoring his siblings. Despite the tension, Margaret pressed on. She bore another son, Geoffrey, in 1501, and her only daughter, Ursula, around 1504. With each birth, the Pole family expanded its presence. But Margaret's fortunes were never far from collapse. The sudden death of her husband left her vulnerable. Tudor widows were entitled to jointure, the legal share of their husband's estate, but Margaret's was meager. She struggled to pay debts, even borrowing money from the king to cover funeral costs. For a time, she and her children lived as guests of nuns at Sion Abbey, their reduced status a stark contrast to her birth as a Plantagenet princess. Yet Margaret endured. She managed what resources she had, sought alliances, and leaned on her connection to Catherine of Aragon, who by then had married Prince Arthur. But even that thread of stability soon unraveled. In 1502, Arthur died suddenly, leaving Catherine a widow and Margaret without her position in Catherine's household. Fate seemed determined to test her resilience. Through these years, Margaret learned the art of survival. She could not fight openly. She could not reclaim her brother's lost inheritance or challenge the Tudors directly. What she could do was play the long game, maintain loyalty, raise her children carefully, and protect what little she had. In time, those choices would bring her both restoration and ruin. Margaret's marriage to Richard Pole may not have been one of romance, but it saved her life. It pulled her out of the perilous spotlight and gave her nearly 2 decades of stability. It allowed her to become a mother, to shape the future of her family, and to walk the delicate line between Plantagenet pride and Tudor caution. And yet, the shadow of her lineage never faded. She was still the niece of kings, the daughter of a duke executed for treason, and the sister of a boy who had died in the Tower. Margaret Pole's life, even in moments of domestic peace, was never free of danger. Her blood remained a weapon others feared she might one day wield. In 1509, the winds of fortune shifted once again for Margaret Pole. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, died after 2 decades on the throne. His son, Henry VIII, ascended in a blaze of youth, energy, and promise. Unlike his father, who had ruled cautiously and suspiciously, the young Henry radiated confidence. And in one of his earliest acts as king, he married Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess who had once been wed to his late brother, Prince Arthur. For Margaret, this union was more than a political marriage. Catherine was her old friend, the woman she had once served in Arthur's household. Now, Catherine was Queen of England. With her rise came an opportunity for Margaret to step out of years of widowhood and near poverty. She was appointed as lady-in-waiting to the new queen, a position that returned her to the heart of royal life. But the real turning point came in 1513. Margaret was officially restored to the title of Countess of Salisbury, soi jure, in her own right. It was an extraordinary moment. Not only did Henry VIII return to her the vast estates once held by her brother Edward, executed years before in the Tower, but he also acknowledged, in a quiet way, that Edward's death had been unjust. Margaret paid a heavy sum, 5,000 marks, to reclaim the lands. Yet the terms were favorable, far more generous than those offered to men in similar circumstances. It was as though Henry, at least for a time, sought to honor her loyalty and erase a stain from the crown's past. Margaret was now one of the wealthiest women in England. She stood as the first woman of the 16th century to hold a peerage in her own name and one of only two throughout the entire century. For someone who had spent years surviving on the margins, living under the protection of nuns and scraping by as a widow, the restoration was nothing short of miraculous. With her estates back in her hands, Margaret proved herself an extraordinary manager. She oversaw farms, rents, and revenues with sharp intelligence. She hired stewards she could trust, often placing women in positions of influence where the law barred her from acting directly. In matters of parliament and military obligations, she used her sons as proxies. Her eldest, Henry Pole, sat in the House of Lords on her behalf and raised troops when called. By the late 1530s, Margaret's wealth was vast. She ranked among the top 5 peers in the kingdom, a position that gave her both power and visibility. For a woman whose childhood had been marred by executions, imprisonment, and confiscations, the rise was staggering. Yet, as always, power in Tudor England was never secure. Her children flourished in the glow of her restoration. Henry, her eldest, became a prominent courtier. Arthur, her second son, served in the Privy Chamber, one of the most intimate circles around the king. Reginald, her third son, the boy she had once been forced to send into the church, studied abroad and grew into a brilliant scholar. Though he never formally took vows as a priest, he gained important ecclesiastical appointments. He served as Dean of Exeter, held positions in York, and moved in the circles of Europe's leading humanists. Margaret's daughter Ursula married into the Stafford family, linking the Poles to yet another line of noble blood. Margaret herself became known as a patron of learning and a supporter of the arts. She corresponded with scholars, and works were dedicated to her, including Erasmus's De Misericordia Dei, translated into English specifically for her benefit. She was a woman of piety and intellect, admired not only for her birth but also for her wisdom. But perhaps Margaret's most meaningful role came in 1520, when she was appointed governess to Princess Mary, Henry and Catherine's daughter. It was a position of immense responsibility. Margaret was not simply a caretaker, she was a second mother. Mary grew deeply attached to her, finding in Margaret the stability and kindness so often missing in the turbulent Tudor court. For years, Margaret guided Mary with affection and discipline. She taught her to read, to pray, to carry herself with dignity befitting a princess. The bond they shared was genuine, and in time, it would become one of the most dangerous ties Margaret would ever form. The 1520s seemed to promise continued stability. Margaret's estates thrived, her children held offices, and she had the ear of the Queen and the love of the princess. But no peace in Henry VIII's England lasted long. When Margaret's son Arthur fell out of favour after the downfall of his patron, the Duke of Buckingham, Margaret herself was dismissed from Mary's household. Though she was later reinstated, the message was clear: in the Tudor court, favour was fleeting. One wrong association could cost everything. Worse still, the king's desires began to shift. By the mid-1520s, Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon was strained. She had borne him only one surviving child, Princess Mary. Henry, desperate for a male heir, grew restless. His eyes turned toward Anne Boleyn, a lady of the court. And when Henry began to seek an annulment from Catherine, Margaret's unwavering loyalty to the Queen placed her in direct opposition to the king's ambitions. Still, during these golden years, Margaret held fast. She had seen dynasties rise and fall, and she knew better than most how precarious a crown could be. Her loyalty was not blind devotion, it was principle. Catherine had been her friend, Mary her charge. Margaret would not betray them, even if it meant crossing Henry himself. For a time, the king tolerated her loyalty. He did not strike against her immediately, perhaps out of respect for her service or her age. But the seeds of suspicion had been planted. In Henry's England, no wealth, no title, no history of loyalty could protect you once the king saw you as an obstacle. And so Margaret, Countess of Salisbury, found herself once again at the height of power, managing vast estates, guiding her children, and shaping the life of a princess. Yet just as in her childhood, the storm clouds were already gathering on the horizon. The years of prosperity would prove to be a fragile golden age, soon to shatter under the weight of Henry's obsessions, religious upheaval, and the dangerous defiance of her own son, Reginald. For now, though, Margaret lived as one of the wealthiest and most respected noblewomen in England, a survivor who had reclaimed her family's honor, rebuilt her fortune, and stood once more at the very heart of England's destiny. By the 1520s, Margaret Pole stood among the wealthiest and most respected women in England. She had estates stretching across the kingdom, children well placed at court, and the restored dignity of her family name. But the Tudor court was never a place of lasting peace. What one day looked like triumph could collapse the next, and Margaret was about to find herself once more on the fault line of history. At the center of it all was Queen Catherine of Aragon, the woman Margaret had long called her friend. Margaret had first known Catherine years earlier, when the Spanish princess came to England to marry Prince Arthur, eldest son of Henry VII. After Arthur's death, Catherine wed his younger brother, Henry VIII. For 2 decades she was Queen of England, Henry's partner, and the mother of their only surviving child, Princess Mary. Margaret's loyalty to Catherine was unshakable. She had served her faithfully, and when Margaret was chosen in 1520 to become Mary's governess, the bond between the families deepened. For Princess Mary, Margaret was not simply a teacher or guardian, she was a second mother. She guided the young girl with affection and discipline, instilling in her a sense of piety, duty, and dignity. But by the mid-1520s, the tides were shifting. Henry VIII, desperate for a male heir, grew restless in his marriage. Catherine, now in her 40s, had given him only one child who lived past infancy. Henry began to see their union as cursed, and his gaze fell upon Anne Boleyn, a clever and ambitious lady of the court. What began as courtly flirtation soon hardened into obsession. Henry convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine had been invalid from the start, since she had once been wed to his brother. He demanded an annulment, seeking the Pope's blessing to set Catherine aside. Catherine, proud and resolute, refused to submit. She declared herself Henry's true wife and Mary his legitimate heir. Margaret Pole did not hesitate. She stood by Catherine and Mary, even as the king grew more insistent, even as Anne Boleyn's influence rose. Margaret's loyalty was both personal and principled. Catherine was her queen. Mary was her charge. To abandon them would have been unthinkable. But in Henry's England, loyalty to the wrong cause could be fatal. By 1531, Catherine was banished from court, stripped of her position, and sent into exile. Margaret's place in Mary's household dissolved with her queen's fall. Yet Margaret refused to abandon the princess. When Mary was declared illegitimate and her jewels and gold were ordered to be surrendered to the crown, Margaret intervened. She offered to care for Mary at her own expense, to serve her without payment, even to finance her household out of her own purse. Henry VIII coldly declined. To him, Margaret's loyalty was foolishness, a direct challenge to his authority. He sneered to foreign ambassadors that she was a foolish woman with no experience worthy of consideration. But those words betrayed something deeper, suspicion. In Henry's eyes, Margaret's devotion to Catherine and Mary was not simply personal, it was political. She was aligning herself with a cause he was determined to crush. The situation grew more dangerous when Margaret's son, Reginald Pole, entered the conflict. Initially, Henry had hoped Reginald, a scholar abroad, might support his annulment. But Reginald instead condemned the king's actions, declaring Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn invalid and rejecting the notion that a monarch could stand as supreme head of the church. His defiance was intellectual treason, and Henry never forgave it. For Margaret, the defiance of her son was both a point of pride and a looming threat. She had raised Reginald in faith, and now his voice carried across Europe, speaking against tyranny. But his words painted a target on her back. To Henry, it no longer mattered whether Margaret herself plotted rebellion. Her bloodline, her loyalty to Catherine and Mary, and her son's public defiance made her dangerous. Meanwhile, the bond between Margaret and Mary only deepened. Mary, stripped of her title and cast aside in favor of her half-sister Elizabeth, clung to Margaret's affection. Letters from ambassadors recorded how devastated Mary was to lose her governess, how she begged for Margaret's return. But Henry would not allow it. He intended to break Mary's will, and Margaret's presence only gave her strength. In 1533, Henry's break with Rome was complete. He married Anne Boleyn in secret, declared his union with Catherine void, and proclaimed himself head of the Church of England. Mary was formally declared a bastard. Her household was dissolved, and she was sent to live at Hatfield, a prisoner in all but name. For Margaret, the years that followed were filled with sorrow. She could no longer be near Mary, no longer shield her from her father's cruelty. Yet she continued to resist in the only ways left to her. She refused to surrender jewels meant for Mary. She continued to honor Catherine as queen, even when the king demanded silence. These were small acts of defiance, but in Tudor England, they were acts of treason in disguise. Henry, consumed by paranoia, saw enemies everywhere. To him, Margaret's defiance was not the stubbornness of an aging noblewoman, it was the echo of a dynasty he had fought so hard to extinguish. She was Plantagenet. She was Catherine's ally. She was Mary's protector. And she was the mother of Reginald Pole, a man who now openly sought foreign allies to overthrow him. In 1536, the storm clouds thickened. Anne Boleyn was executed, and Henry married Jane Seymour. Catherine of Aragon died that same year, leaving Mary motherless. Margaret, now well into her 60s, must have sensed the walls closing in. She had endured the fall of kings, the deaths of her parents and brother, the loss and restoration of estates. She had survived the brutal whims of fortune longer than most. But loyalty, the very virtue that had defined her, was about to become the reason for her undoing. Margaret Pole had chosen faithfulness over self-preservation. She had chosen to stand by Catherine of Aragon and Princess Mary when others fled to the king's side. And in doing so, she had crossed an invisible line. In Henry VIII's court, defiance was treason, and treason was death. Her golden years of power were ending. The next chapter of her life would plunge her back into the same shadows she had known as a child: suspicion, imprisonment, and the ever-present threat of execution. By the mid-1530s, Margaret Pole was one of the last great noblewomen of England, a survivor of dynasties, wars, and betrayals. But her survival was about to be tested like never before. For while she tried to live quietly, managing her estates and keeping her loyalty fixed on Catherine of Aragon and Princess Mary, her son Reginald was shaping a destiny that would drag his entire family into the king's crosshairs. Reginald Pole had been sent into the church as a boy, partly because his widowed mother could not afford to support all of her children. He grew into a gifted scholar, studying in Italy and mingling with the brightest minds of Europe. At first, Henry VIII looked on Reginald with hope. Here was a brilliant young man of Plantagenet blood who might support the king's controversial decision to annul his marriage and declare himself head of the Church of England. But Henry underestimated both Reginald's conscience and his courage. In 1531, Reginald broke with the king. He declared publicly that Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn was invalid and that no monarch had the authority to stand above the Pope as supreme head of the Church. It was more than a theological argument, it was a direct challenge to Henry's claim to absolute power. The defiance did not stop there. By 1532, rumors circulated across Europe that Reginald might marry Princess Mary, Catherine's daughter. If true, it would unite Plantagenet blood with Tudor blood, creating a claim to the throne stronger than Henry's own. Nothing came of the idea, but the whispers were enough to make Henry furious. Reginald then sharpened his pen into a weapon. He authored a scathing pamphlet that not only condemned Henry's annulment but questioned the very legitimacy of his rule. He urged other monarchs to oppose England's king. His words carried across the continent, reaching the ears of emperors, princes, and popes. For Henry, it was unforgivable. Reginald had not just defied him, he had humiliated him in the eyes of Europe. In 1536, when the great northern uprising known as the Pilgrimage of Grace erupted, the Pope, Paul III, made a fateful decision. Despite the fact that Reginald was not yet ordained, he appointed him a cardinal and tasked him with supporting the rebellion. The goal was nothing less than the restoration of Catholicism in England and the removal of Henry's reformist ministers. The rebellion failed, but Reginald did not stop. By 1539, he was working with Emperor Charles V to coordinate an embargo against England. From abroad, he became the living embodiment of resistance to Henry's religious revolution. At home, this meant disaster for his family. Henry's paranoia had always run deep, but now it boiled over. He began to see treason everywhere, even in the smallest gestures. Reginald's open defiance meant that his relatives in England could be painted as accomplices. Margaret Pole, her sons, and even her grandchildren suddenly became suspects in a conspiracy that may or may not have existed. That same year, whispers of an assassination plot against Henry spread through the court. Whether the rumors were true or fabricated hardly mattered. What mattered was that the Pole family, with its Plantagenet blood and Reginald's rebellion, provided the perfect scapegoats. In August 1538, Margaret's son Geoffrey was arrested by Thomas Cromwell. Under interrogation, he cracked. Tortured and terrified, he confessed to maintaining contact with Reginald. Worse, he implicated his elder brother, Henry Pole, Lord Montague, suggesting that Montague had also known of Reginald's activities. The net tightened quickly. In November, Margaret herself was arrested, along with Montague and several others. She was 65 years old, a grandmother, a woman whose greatest crime had been loyalty to her queen and devotion to her children. But in Henry's eyes, her bloodline and her connections were enough to condemn her. On November 12, 1538, Margaret was interrogated. Despite her age and the pressure she faced, she held firm. She denied all wrongdoing. Even William Fitzwilliam, Earl of Southampton, an enemy who despised her, admitted grudgingly that her composure was remarkable. She did not falter, even as the shadow of the tower fell over her once again. By January 1539, the case against the Poles was escalating. Henry Montague was convicted of treason and executed. Geoffrey, spared for his confession, lived under the weight of his betrayal. Margaret's grandson, a boy of only 15, was also imprisoned in the tower alongside her. The boy had committed no crime but bore the same cursed bloodline. Then came the so-called evidence. Cromwell's agents claimed to have discovered a tunic in one of Margaret's properties, embroidered with the 5 wounds of Christ, a symbol linked to the Pilgrimage of Grace. To the king, this was proof that Margaret supported Reginald's rebellion. To historians, it was almost certainly fabricated, a desperate attempt to legitimize her arrest. For months, Margaret lingered in the tower. She was treated with a measure of dignity, her clothing was fine, her food sufficient, but the uncertainty must have weighed heavily. Would she be spared, as her father had not been? Would she watch her grandchildren grow, or would her name, like so many Plantagenets before her, be crushed under the Tudor heel? Her fate, like always, was not hers to choose. By the spring of 1539, Parliament passed a bill of attainder against her, stripping her of her titles and estates without trial. The Countess of Salisbury, restored just years earlier, was now once again dispossessed. Her life hung not on evidence or justice but on the whims of a king consumed by fear and rage. Margaret Pole had survived the Wars of the Roses, the fall of Richard III, and the suspicion of Henry VII. But in Henry VIII, she faced a ruler who combined the paranoia of her father's world with the unchecked power of an absolute monarch. For the second time in her life, she was a prisoner in the Tower of London. And this time, escape was far less likely. The fall of the Pole family was complete. Montague was gone. Geoffrey disgraced. Reginald exiled but unrepentant. Margaret and her grandson behind bars. And Henry, watching with suspicion from his throne, was not finished yet. For nearly 3 years, Margaret Pole lingered in the Tower of London. She was treated with a measure of dignity, her clothes were fine, her food was sufficient, her servants permitted. To some, it seemed as if Henry VIII had no real intention of executing her. She was, after all, an old woman in her late 60s, far from the intrigues of court. Perhaps she would simply live out her days as a prisoner, like so many before her. But in Tudor England, mercy was an illusion. On May 27, 1541, without warning, the order was given. Margaret Pole was to die that very morning. There was no new evidence, no trial, no formal sentence. Only the king's command, issued suddenly, as though in a fit of fear or anger. Historians believe Henry may have been rattled by fresh rumors that Reginald Pole, still in exile, was plotting with foreign powers to invade England and rescue his mother. Whatever the reason, the decision was final. Margaret was told she had less than an hour to prepare. For a woman who had survived the Wars of the Roses, the fall of Richard III, the paranoia of Henry VII, and the shifting sands of Henry VIII's court, the news must have been both shocking and surreal. She had endured so much, and yet here she was, condemned not for any act of treason but simply for being who she was, a Plantagenet. When she was led into the courtyard, she found not a proper scaffold but a hastily prepared low block of wood. Worse still, the Tower's official executioner was absent, away on duty in the north. In his place stood a young, inexperienced boy, trembling as he gripped the heavy axe. The crowd that gathered knew at once that this would not be an ordinary execution. Margaret composed herself with remarkable courage. One account suggests she appeared confused, as if she did not even know the full charges against her. But when the truth sank in, she faced death with dignity. She commended her soul to God, asked the small audience to pray for the king and his family, and sent her love to Princess Mary, the girl she had raised like her own daughter. Then came the moment of horror. The boy executioner swung the axe, and missed. Instead of severing her neck, the blade hacked deep into her shoulder. Margaret must have cried out in agony, her body twisting instinctively in pain. The boy raised the axe again and struck the base of her skull. Still, her head did not come free. Blow after blow rained down, clumsy, brutal, each cut a failure. Witnesses watched in shock as one of the greatest noblewomen of England was butchered like an animal. At last, her head was severed, but her body was left mutilated. She was 67 years old. News of the execution spread quickly. To Henry's enemies, it confirmed what they already believed, that the king was consumed by paranoia and cruelty. To his allies, it was a chilling reminder of what loyalty, or bloodline, could cost. Even William Fitzwilliam, who had once called her foolish, had admitted that she was composed and dignified in interrogation. Now she was remembered not for folly, but for courage in the face of terror. Her son Reginald, upon hearing the news, was devastated. He withdrew into solitude, mourning the loss of the mother who had sacrificed so much for him. When he emerged, he declared, "I am now the son of a martyr." For him, Margaret's death was not simply the end of her life, it was the sealing of her sainthood in the eyes of those who resisted Henry's tyranny. Margaret was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower of London, the same resting place as Anne Boleyn and so many other victims of Henry's wrath. Her grave was unmarked, a quiet end for a woman who had once been among the wealthiest and most powerful peers in the realm. Centuries later, the Catholic Church would remember her differently. In 1886, she was beatified by Pope Leo XIII, recognized as Blessed Margaret Pole. No longer just a victim of Tudor politics, she was honored as a woman of steadfast faith, dignity, and moral strength. Her legacy is complex. She was born into the most powerful family in England, yet spent much of her life as a pawn in dynastic struggles. She was a loyal servant, a wise landowner, a devoted mother, and a patron of learning. Yet history remembers her most vividly for how she died, cruelly, needlessly, and unjustly. Her story is a warning of what happens when fear outweighs justice, when power silences loyalty, and when a king allows paranoia to consume his rule. Margaret Pole never sought the throne. She never led an army or raised a rebellion. She tried, above all else, to serve faithfully, to raise her children with dignity, and to stay true to her conscience. But her bloodline made her dangerous, and in Henry VIII's England, that was enough. The last great Plantagenet had been cut down, not by a skilled executioner's blade, but by the trembling hands of a frightened boy. Her dignity endured, even as her body was mutilated. And through that dignity, Margaret Pole's name lived on, not as a threat to a king, but as a martyr to faith and loyalty. In the end, Henry VIII's reign is remembered for many things: the break with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries, and the 6 wives who defined his personal life. But among its darkest stains is the death of Margaret Pole. A death that did not need to happen. A death that revealed, more than anything else, the fear that haunted a king who ruled through terror. History should have remembered Margaret for her wisdom, her loyalty, and her resilience. Instead, it remembers the sound of a dull axe striking bone, the cries of a noble woman betrayed, and the silence that followed in the Tower courtyard. Margaret Pole's life was a testament to survival. Her death, a testament to injustice. And her legacy, one of courage in a time when courage came at the highest cost.